After years of rumors, spy photos, and Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the C8 mid-engine Corvette has finally arrived. Now in its 8th generation, the C8 comes with a mid-engine for the first time ever in the history of a production Corvette. It's poised as the most radical shift in Corvette design ever, and some say the viability of the entire brand now rests with the C8. The mid-engine is a massive departure from tradition and carries huge risk for GM as it struggles with an aging fan base and a shrinking overall car market. You see, the C8 is not the first time GM has flirted with a mid-engine Corvette. In fact, the idea for a mid-engine Corvette concept goes all the way back to 1959 with the father of the Corvette, Zora Arkus Duntov. The first Chevrolet engineering research vehicle, the CERV I, was developed by Arkus Duntov as an open-wheel, mid-engine single-seat prototype race car. It had a tube frame design, independent suspension, and it preceded the first mid-engine Indy car by only 1 year. According to Corvette historian and former Car and Driver editor-in-chief Carl Lutzwegen, Zora understood the traction and handling advantages of placing the engine behind the cockpit and ahead of the rear axle. Here's the car in 2018, and I think it sounds amazing. It was powered by an aluminum block 4.8-liter V8 making 353 horsepower. Pretty amazing numbers and technology for the era. Factory-backed racing was banned at the time, but Zora didn't care. He showed off his creation at the F1 Grand Prix in Riverside, California in 1960. Although it never saw competition, the car was used to demonstrate its handling superiority and the advantages of mid-engine placement. Zora ultimately drove the car at Pikes Peak, Sebring, and Daytona. The CERV I was just the first of many mid-engine Corvette prototypes. The CERV II was unleashed in 1964 and featured a super sleek body and four-wheel drive to gain an advantage in inclement weather, which often occurred during endurance racing. The CERV II was supposed to be Chevy's counterpunch to the Ford GT40, which was also mid-engined. Initially, the plan was for a prototype and 6 race cars. A 6.2-liter, 490 horsepower overhead cam, fuel-injected engine motivated this car with two automatic transmissions to send power to all 4 wheels. Remember, this is the early 1960s. Reportedly, it reached 200 miles per hour in 1964 at GM's Proving Grounds. Although only one was ever made, Zora proposed it as a demonstration vehicle for a production Super Corvette that was unfortunately never built. Amazingly, it did 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds, which in 2020 is still unbelievably quick. But back in 1960, those were mind-boggling performance numbers. By 1968, Chevy was getting more concerned about the GT40 threat from Ford and rolled out the Astro II. It's also known as the XP880 prototype at the New York Auto Show. This car ignited a firestorm of speculation as to whether it would become the next Corvette with its swoopy aerodynamic skin. It used existing parts from Chevy and included a 400 horsepower, 427 cubic inch V8 mounted backwards and made it to a 2-speed transaxle from a Pontiac Tempest. Even though the car was a hit with the auto show, ultimately, the Corvette was selling really well at the time, and the Astro II was just shelved. By 1969, the XP882 was the next prototype, and this time was built by Arkus Duntov's team. It was positioned as a competitor to the Di Tommaso Pantera, and actually this was a far more modern-looking sort of sculpted form. And once again, it shared components, the drivetrain components, with the Pontiac Tornado. It had a Chevy 454 cubic inch V8, however, it weighed about 1,000 pounds, and that was just a little bit too heavy, and ultimately only 2 of these were made. Amazingly, Chevy replaced the V8 engine by taking 2 prototype rotary engines from the Chevy Vega. These are a Wankel design. They put them together and made a 4-rotor prototype engine for this particular version. Now the pedals in this car were fixed, but they could be moved into position electrically. One of the really unique styling features about this car was the doors that moved up and they actually folded in the middle. There were many versions of the Aerovette, including one that had an aluminum body. Now personally, I think from the era, this is one of the most stunning and elegant designs that GM put together. In the early 70s, the fuel crisis was in full swing in America, and the general manager at the time, John DeLorean, unfortunately had to cancel the project because it was just too fuel inefficient. So once again, we lost another opportunity to have a mid-engine Corvette. However, by 1977, General Motors had put the Aerovette project back online. They yanked the 4-rotor engine and replaced it with a 400 cubic inch V8. The GM chairman actually approved the Aerovette for production, and it was slated to be the 1980 Corvette. However, things once again weren't meant to be. Obviously, I think you know how that part of the story turned out, and yet again, we were denied the opportunity for a mid-engine Corvette. Then we enter a period of 11 years of silence on the mid-engine prototypes. However, in 1986, something called the Indy concept car debuts as a styling exercise. On this prototype, you can see a real clear break from the 70s. It doesn't have the same kind of lines that the 70s did. This one is round, it's sculpted, and it's super futuristic. The body was built by C8 in Italy, and though this actually never became a running, working prototype, you can see that the design influenced future Corvette prototypes. GM took this very round styling exercise and put it in a wind tunnel, and unfortunately the car wanted to act like a giant wing. So this generation was never meant to be, but it definitely influenced what I think is perhaps the most iconic and maybe the most interesting of the prototype cars. The CERV III, which is perhaps the most iconic and the most recognizable of all the prototype cars, was powered by a 650 horsepower LT5 engine. It was an all-wheel drive car that had a special chain that connected two 3-speed automatic transmissions together. There was a differential that split the power between the front and the rear, and it was controlled by a computer. Pretty revolutionary stuff. It appeared at the Detroit Auto Show in 1990, and I think even today it really has the lines and sort of the essence of a world-class supercar. This car was packed with cutting-edge technology. The body was made from carbon fiber and Kevlar, and it was reinforced with honeycomb aluminum. It had a very unique feature, which is these Lamborghini-inspired scissor doors that opened upwards. The brakes had dual rotors on each corner, so that's a total of 8 rotors. The idea was to double the surface area to improve braking from high speeds. Unlike the Indy Corvette, this was actually a research and development car, and they designed it with the intention of taking it into production. This car was built by the race builders at Lotus, which General Motors happened to own at the time. The technology in this car was very advanced. The suspension had actuators instead of traditional dampers, and the car was able to measure yaw, pitch, roll, and so forth by a network of sensors that today is pretty commonplace. However, back in the early 90s, this was really revolutionary. Unfortunately, mass production technology wasn't quite up to the task of what the engineers wanted to do with the suspension, and ultimately they had to abandon the project. So what happened to the CERV III? It was filled with all this advanced technology, and unfortunately, because of that, it was estimated that to bring it into the showroom, it would have cost a buyer $300,000 to $400,000. That's well outside the price of any Corvette, well into supercar territory, and really it was just decided that was outside of the Corvette's core mission, which is to provide performance at an affordable price. And General Motors was in another slump at the time, and the CERV III was the last mid-engine prototype we were going to see for quite a while, until of course the C8. Today, Chevrolet confirmed that the new C8, the base one, will be called the Stingray. The Stingray name has a lot of historical significance for Chevrolet. It was used as the name on some of the early concept cars, and then again with the C2 Corvette. However, the name was retired in 1976, and we wouldn't see it again until the last generation, the C7. While the name may carry over from the last generation, the new Corvette actually represents a really seismic shift in the history of the brand. So why did Chevy move the engine behind the passenger compartment? There are many good technical reasons. Zora, the father of the Corvette, believed that the handling is superior in part because the center of gravity is closer to the center of mass of the car, and that means it can have a lower polar moment of inertia. In layman's terms, because the engine is closer to the center of the vehicle, it can change direction more quickly. Also, because of the placement closer to the rear axle, when you apply power, it goes down more efficiently. However, I think one of the main reasons, and perhaps the real reason for the seismic shift, is because Chevy wants a new buyer. Historically and significantly, the median age for a buyer of the Corvette right now is over 60 years old. Chevy wants to attract a younger buyer who's been looking at a performance car, but perhaps doesn't like the pricing structure that Porsche has gotten into recently. There was talk early on about making the C7 the next mid-engine Corvette, but as you know, in 2009, during the Great Recession, General Motors entered bankruptcy. There was even talk of axing the Corvette, and it could have gone the way of Pontiac. However, it was discovered during audits that the Corvette was actually one of the profit centers for GM at the time. But as GM emerged from bankruptcy, we know now that Zora's passion project has finally made it to production and will be the next generation, the 2020 Corvette. In just one more day, we are going to find out everything about the Corvette. We're going to find out how much the LT2 engine makes, we're going to find out the price, and everything else significant about the car. I am going to be live streaming from the event on Instagram. If you want to ask me questions that the mainstream press probably isn't going to answer for you, follow me on Instagram. It's right over here. I'm going to publish a video as soon as possible after the event. Subscribe. My name is Eric. I will see you at the reveal.